We go from one controversial, potentially conspiratorial story underwritten with hard facts to another story where facts are continually denied and thrown shade upon in order, I think, to control particular narratives, or more specifically, counter-narratives. But now to bring us this story in new and vivid light is Jimmy Tobias, an investigative journalist like me from The Nation and Intercept. Jimmy famously won a lawsuit against the NIH revealing secret emails between Fauci and other scientists discussing the Wuhan lab leak theory. Jimmy, real early on, prior to the public discourse being, in my opinion, heavily directed towards the natural origin theory, there were emails exchanged between Fauci, that dude from the WHO called Farah, yeah, him, and representatives of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a charity, by the way. They were exchanging emails about potential origins of the coronavirus pandemic. Tell me, what were your objectives when writing your recent article, mate?
Yeah, well, I sued the NIH to obtain these records, and they were pretty eye-opening, newsworthy, I thought. And in writing this article, we were really just trying to lay them out in the context in which they were written so people could see what some of the most important and influential people who were, directing the pandemic response were saying about the origins of the virus in the very early days of the outbreak.
What conclusions have you drawn, or what in particular did you find interesting? What in particular do you think was at odds with a broadly conveyed public message?
Well, I mean, the documents show that Dr. Fauci in early 2020 was alerted to concerns, among some of the world's top virologists, that the virus looked potentially engineered. And what followed was a series of confidential calls and emails between Dr. Fauci, NIH Director Francis Collins, Patrick Vallance, who was the chief science advisor to the UK government, and a group of other prominent scientists, discussing the virus's origins. And early on, some of the scientists on these calls and emails really couldn't figure out how this virus was produced in nature, given some of its unusual features. I mean, they were stunned by it. They thought it may have come from a lab. Other people on these calls and emails disagreed and thought it looked like it came from nature. But these deliberations went on for more than a week. Pretty early in the discussions, they sort of discarded the idea that it was engineered and instead focused on an idea that it was sort of accidentally created and released from a lab via this type of laboratory process called serial passage experiments. And so during this time, they also started writing up drafts of what would become the very famous proximal origin paper, one of the best read papers in science history. And that paper ultimately found that the virus came from nature. So these conversations started on January 31st. By February 8th, one of the scientists involved, Christian Anderson of Scripps, described the focus of the group's work as an effort to, quote, disprove any type of lab theory. But even after all this debate, they still couldn't come down on one side. They couldn't say it was a lab origin. They couldn't say it was a natural origin. I mean, they weren't ready to publish. And then somehow between February 8th and early March, they overcame this uncertainty and published this proximal origin paper that came down very, very strongly on a natural origin side. And the documents don't really show how they overcame their uncertainty, how they went from, this looks engineered, this looks like it could have been an accidental lab leak, to, the proximal origin conclusion, which was they said they don't believe any type of, lab-based scenario is plausible. So that's sort of in sum what these documents show, this conversation, this very heated, anxious, confidential conversation in January and February 2020.
Stay free with Russell Brand. See it first on Rumble.